Live now, going live. Oh, thank you so much. Live right now. Year 7 history, British curriculum right now. Mr. Willis Wandere teaching international system right now. First chapter this morning, we are looking at how do we find out about history. This is a very important question for any historians. And most historians will say, how do we reconstruct history? That is very, very important to know how do historians know what happens, the event that happens thousands of years ago. And we are going to look at sources of history. That's a very important question. We're going to understand how do we know what happened thousands of years ago. And we are going to use three sources of history. We are going to look at written accounts, we are going to look at archaeology, and we are going to look at oral traditions, how these sources are important, how these sources are important. And number one source we are going to look at is written accounts, especially when you're talking about the Romans. Romans lived 1,500 years ago. The Romans lived 1,500 years ago, and therefore written accounts will be very important. And we had great Roman writers. We had great Roman writers, people like Tacitus. People like Tacitus was one of the great Roman writers. People like Suetonius. People like Suetonius also wrote extensively on the Roman Empire, wrote extensively on the Roman Empire. So people like Livy, and they have provided us with great evidence. They have provided us with great evidence about the Romans. They have provided us with very vital evidence. And therefore, as we go through year 7 history, we'll be reading some of their works. We'll be reading some of their works. Great writers providing great information about the Romans. And the Romans also liked reading history. The Romans liked reading history. So we can read comprehensively about the Romans. We can read comprehensively about the Romans. So it's important to remember that writers have played a significant role, and still historians use written materials to know more about the past. Examples of written accounts: one can use newspapers. We have daily newspapers in most countries. One can use magazines, weekly magazines. Those ones come in plenty in most countries, right? We'll be talking about magazines, political magazines, and all this. Sorry. One can also use journals to understand more about how historians can use written documents to do their works, periodicals. Those are just examples of written accounts. So written accounts, very important, but also as a source of history, written accounts has limitations. Written accounts has limitations. And one of the limitations of written accounts, somebody can say that written accounts can be biased. When we say biased, we mean that the author of the source might not be objective, might not be balanced, perhaps because he's supporting a certain view or he has some attitude about that event he's discussing, then he can be biased. So sometimes historical accounts can be biased. Also, historical written documents can also be exaggerated. Written documents can also be exaggerated. Something can be blown out of proportion. Something can be blown out of proportion and therefore magnified, and then it cannot serve the purpose. It cannot serve the purpose. Therefore, sometimes it's good to read between the lines when we're talking about written documents. They have their own limitations. Therefore, Roman writing, very important when we're discussing about the Roman history. Yes, 7 British curriculum right now at this particular time. Then archaeology forms a very important source of information about the Romans. The Romans lived thousands of years ago, but a historian can use archaeology. That means studying the remains of the past of man. That means studying the remains of the past of man. And these remains can be divided into two: artifacts and fossils. Artifacts and fossils. Therefore, artifacts are those tools and weapons used by the Romans, tools and weapons used by the Romans. So important to remember artifacts and fossils. Those are skeletons, the skulls that have been recovered, excavated, and removed from the earth. So it's important to remember archaeology. It's very, very important to study that. And when we talk about archaeology, perhaps how do these archaeologists know where they're going to dig? That is what we call archaeologist clues. That's what we call archaeologist clues. And perhaps something Roman has been found nearby, like a piece of pottery. That's where now the archaeologists will go and dig and excavate. If we find something nearby, then we know perhaps people lived here, and that is a place which archaeologists will go and excavate. So something found, something of historical importance, something of historical importance has been found nearby, and that place is where archaeologists will go and dig and excavate and remove the materials, the past materials of man. So it's important to remember something of historical significance has been found nearby, and therefore that makes it to be a better place to go and excavate, makes it a better place to go and excavate. So something has been found nearby. But also, archaeologists know a place where they can go to dig. If a Roman writer perhaps says there was a camp at that particular place, where a Roman writer says there was a camp or a fort or a base where the Romans lived, a camp or a base where the Romans lived. So you'll go there because of what the writer has discussed about that place, and then the archaeologists will go there and excavate and remove the remains. So the clue comes from the writer. The clue comes from the writer. So it's important to remember that a writer can say. And also, archaeologists will go to places where there was buildings which can be spotted from the air, which can be spotted from the air. So important to remember places where there were once buildings can be spotted from the air, which is also important when we are discussing about the Romans, when we are discussing about the Romans. And sometimes places have Roman connections, places which end with Chester, Manchester, Chester City. Those are places where the Romans lived. Those are places where the Romans lived, and archaeologists could easily go and dig the ground and find the remains of man and find the remains of man. So archaeology is a very important tool to know more about the Romans, to know more about the Romans. So one definitely will use archaeology to try and discover and understand more about the Romans. So it's important to remember that archaeology is important tool when we're discussing about the Romans. So archaeological evidence will be very important when we talk about the Romans. So archaeology is one of the sources of history, very important to remember. So in archaeology, perhaps one will know the lifestyle of the people in the Roman times. If they excavate, they will be able to reconstruct the lifestyle of the people in the Roman times. They will be able to know the building, the shelters that the people lived in at that particular time, which is very important to remember. And they also can know about the diet of the Romans. They can also know about the religions of the Romans. So it's important to remember that some of these things will play a significant role, will play a significant role. So the source of history, archaeology, very important. Archaeology, very important. So we have the archaeological sites which have been excavated, the archaeological sites which have been excavated, and the remains of man have been found there. So archaeology, very important when we're discussing about the Romans. Archaeology is very important when we are discussing about the Romans. So archaeological findings, artifacts and fossils, very important to remember when we're discussing about the Romans. So it's important to remember some of these issues. And that a third source of history will be the oral traditions, will be the oral traditions. So we're talking about oral traditions. This is a word of mouth passed from one generation to another. It goes from one generation to another generation. Word of mouth. This can be songs, this can be legends, this can be proverbs. All these will contribute a great way in getting the information. Legends, like when we're discussing about the Romans, we'll be looking at the legend of Remus and Romulus. The legend of Remus and Romulus. These are twins who are supposed to have been the founders of the Roman Empire. And that legend is famous, has gone from one generation to another. The Roman children are told about the legend of Remus and Romulus, which is very important when we're discussing about the Romans. So oral traditions perhaps greatly play a significant role. But also, as we were saying, they also have their own limitations. One perhaps will be talking about, you can forget about the events that happened a long time ago. So it has a drawback, it has a limitation. Therefore, you'll be talking about somebody forgetting about that, and then perhaps the idea of exaggeration comes in. The person telling you might exaggerate what happens. If you look at the legend of Remus and Romulus, that legend has been exaggerated to a great length where some things are not believable in that legend. So it's important to remember that is a source of history. So for the first topic here, 7, you'll be looking at the question, how do we find out about history? Definition of history, things that happens in the past. But how do we find out about these things that happened thousands of years ago? And we have sources of information, and we have sources of information to help us to understand more about things that happened thousands of years ago. So it's important to remember those are some of the tools used by the Romans. And the findings, archaeological findings, are very important and very interesting. You'll find that the archaeologists will excavate everyday life. But archaeological as a source of history, as we wind up this lesson for year 7, has also some limitations in that sometimes it's not easy to locate places where you'll excavate. Sometimes it's not easy to locate those places where you are going to excavate. So that will be a hindrance, that will be a stumbling block, that will be one of the stumbling blocks. So it's important to remember that would be one of the stumbling blocks. And also, perhaps some of these remains have broken down into small fragments, and therefore to reconstruct them, to piece them together, is not easy. To piece them together is not easy. So that will be a hindrance. And we know digging down the ground is not an easy thing. Down the ground is not an easy thing. So therefore, digging down the ground is not an easy thing. Therefore, that also perhaps is a difficult task. Being a archaeologist is not an easy job, digging down the ground and trying to find out materials is not easy as one would presume. So those are some of the issues when you are dealing with archaeology, but archaeology a very, very important source of history and has contributed greatly to perhaps giving a lot of information to the historians who study both past events and current events. So archaeology has contributed a lot to historical significance. Therefore, it's important that we know about the sources of history, and that is an opener for year 7 as we go through the Roman history. The most important thing will be to understand, how does somebody know about the Romans? How does somebody know about the Romans? 1,500 years ago, the Romans established one of the biggest empires in the world. It became a center of civilization, and it influenced the whole world. That's what we call the legacy left to us by the Romans. The Romans gone, but not yet forgotten. The Romans gone, but not yet forgotten. They left a lot to us. They left a lot to us. And we are going to look at that impact. And we are going to look at that impact when we will analyze the history of the Romans, the language they left to us, the Latin language extensively used throughout. In fact, in England, some schools still teach the Latin language. Some schools still teach the Latin language. So the language having existed and survived until the present time, having succeeded up to the present time. Therefore, you are talking about the impact or the legacy left to us by the Romans, a great legacy, the language. We also know the Romans were great builders, architects. They built great buildings. Some of them still exist until the present moment. The Colosseum, one of the biggest stadiums built by the Romans, still exists until this present time, still exists at this present time. Therefore, a great impact in the world. The structure of the government, the Senate, the Romans have the Senate, and this is a political institution that has survived until this present moment. Look at the US, they have a chamber known as the Senate. So the democracy, they're the mothers of democracy during the reign of the Romans. Therefore, you're talking about this watershed of democracy, the world, and the democracy that is applied in the world today started during the reigns of the Romans. As we try to go through these, as we try to uncover who the Romans were and their role in history and what they have done so far. This is going to be a very interesting syllabus as we finish. So, as we look at the sources, we'll be able also to look at the limitations. You talk about a source, and then you look about the disadvantages. You talk about a source, and then you look at the limitations that are there. So, I finished my lesson this morning. Wish you the best as we continue the series for year 7, International British Curriculum, the Roman Empire. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you so much for that video.